So yes, thank you very much for having me today. I'm really excited to be speaking to you, and I am a senior content designer at Content Design London. And as Millie said, I'm going to be talking to you about applying trauma-informed principles to content design. Before I start my talk, I just want to make you aware of some of the topics I'll be mentioning. So I will be using examples from my work, and I'll be touching on work with survivors of FGM and applicants to Scotland's redress scheme, which was for children who were abused in care. I won't be going into the experiences of these people, but I will talk about some of the issues that came up. And towards the end of the talk, I'll be mentioning some user research around planning a funeral. So I just wanted to let you know that these topics will come up, and if you need to leave now or at any point, please feel free to. But let's jump in. And I don't know about you, but I am a worrier. And I've got a cartoon here that I hard relate to. It's a woman doing a yoga pose called the Warrior, but it's been renamed the Worrier. And as she's meant to be freeing her mind, instead she's running through all the things she's worrying about. My favorite is whether she should have chips for tea, and the answer to that is always yes. But that's me, and it's probably all of us at one time or another, because stress surrounds our lives, and often so does anxiety and even trauma. And I think people often have very predefined ideas of what trauma is and where it might be relevant or not relevant, and we'll get to that. But the reason I talk about all three is because we often use these terms almost interchangeably without thinking, and they might be thought of as points on a spectrum with stress at one end and trauma at the other. But what's important to us when we're creating content is that wherever someone might be on the spectrum, the feelings, the emotions, the physical sensations they're having, it's going to impact how they consume your content. And there can be overlap between these three, and they don't always or often sit alone, and they can often share physical symptoms too, and it can be really hard to separate them out. But we're not here to diagnose people or say which category our users fall into, if they're stressed, anxious, or traumatized. Because the good news is that the principles for creating good content apply equally to people in any of these three categories. And here's the thing about stress and trauma. You can never know what is going to be difficult for your users, and you can't assume. So when I first started working in this area, someone told me that I needed to be really clear what sort of things it applied to. They said there were things that trauma-informed principles obviously applied to, like help for survivors of abuse or people who are dying. They said, it's not for people who are changing gas suppliers though, is it? But actually, it might be. Because you don't know why that person is changing their gas supplier. Is it because they can't afford to pay for fuel? Is it because they've had to move house suddenly and unexpectedly? Is it because their parent is going into supported care and they're trying to sort out utilities? You never know what the person coming across your content is going through. So yes, there are definitely contexts where what we're going to talk about today might be more relevant than others, but it's always worth thinking about and doing the best that we can. So let's start to look at stress, anxiety, and trauma in terms of content and creating information for people who are experiencing them. So content designers make content that people can understand. That's our bread and butter. And a lot of our work is making information accessible to everyone. And this means that we think about things like screen readers, about captions, about color contrasts. But do we think about stress, anxiety, and trauma? Because we should. And I want to talk a bit about what physically happens to us when we're stressed. So stress, anxiety, and trauma all release the hormones adrenaline and cortisol. And no matter who we are, how smart we are, and how well we do things under normal circumstances, stress hormones can make it harder to read, to understand information, make decisions, and consider and reflect on information. These are the very things that we're trying to help our users do. Helping people understand and navigate information is the essence of our work. So stress, anxiety, and trauma deserve our attention because they make it harder to do the things that we're trying to help people do. So here's what the British Dyslexia Association say about the impact of stress and anxiety on learning. When we're stressed or highly anxious, the hormones that the body produces, particularly cortisol, divert essential resources from the brain to the large muscles in the body in preparation for fight and flight. So in simple terms, the thinking part of the brain can't work effectively during periods of heightened stress and increased anxiety. Humans can also trigger this stress reaction by simply thinking about or remembering the stressful situation. So even if they're not actually in the stressful situation, remembering it would potentially have the same impact on the individual. So stress makes it harder to learn. It also makes it harder to make decisions. A poll for the American Psychological Association during COVID found nearly 1/3 of adults said sometimes they were so stressed about the pandemic, they struggled to make basic decisions, such as what to wear or what to eat. So when our bodies are worrying, our brains aren't working as well. So we need our information clear, simple, and to the point. And that's going to help someone who's going through stress, anxiety, and trauma. And here's an example. This is a poster for CPR. And it tells us to do CPR to the tune of Staying Alive, because it's simple. Most of us know the song without thinking too hard about it. And if we're ever in that highly stressful situation where we're having to do CPR, we can probably remember the tune when we won't remember how many pulses we're meant to do. This is another nice one. If you suspect a stroke, think fast. And the picture has one-word explanations of what to look for and what to do if someone's having a stroke. The icons spell out the word fast, and the instruction at the top is clear: act fast and call 999. And again, in high stress situations, we can possibly remember that. We can probably understand it, but it's clear. And in both cases, it also points people towards support. So we've got an understanding of why it's harder to take in information when we're stressed, anxious, or experiencing trauma. But what do we do about it? And here's where trauma-informed practice and principles can help. So trauma-informed practice understands how trauma affects people's neurological, biological, psychological, and social development, and it works to avoid re-traumatization. And you might have heard of re-traumatization in the context of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And PTSD is a mental health condition that can develop after experiencing traumatic events. It was first recognized in war veterans, where it was sometimes called shell shock. And for some people, the perception remains that it's only for soldiers, but a wide range of traumatic experiences can cause PTSD. Some people living with trauma will experience stress reactions to a new event that feel as intense as the original event. This can include feeling like the trauma is happening right now, as well as intense, unpleasant physical sensations. And that is what's known as re-traumatization. So trauma-informed principles help people work with individuals who've experienced trauma. And the principles take into account people's previous experiences and give guidance to try and avoid causing further harm. That's re-traumatization. So I first came across this work when I was a content designer working on Scotland's Redress Scheme. And Scotland's Redress Scheme is a Scottish government scheme that was set up for survivors of abuse in certain care settings in Scotland. They could apply for a payment and also access to an apology and counselling. I'll be coming back to this piece of work throughout the talk, so it's worth explaining the scheme a little now. There were two application streams for survivors. One was for £10,000, and that was called a fixed rate, and the other was what was called individually assessed, and that was up to £100,000. And a few things to mention about the survivors. We knew from other information that children who were in care often had lower literacy and numeracy than other children, and that continues through to adulthood. We also know that people who've been in care are more likely to have had adverse experiences. And a study from the Rees Centre at Oxford showed that people who've been in care are more likely than the general population to be unemployed, have mental health problems, spend time in prison or psychiatric institutions, or experience homelessness at some point in their lives. So even before we account for the impact of trauma, the people applying for the scheme were potentially at a disadvantage when it comes to accessing and understanding information. And they were more likely to have faced adversity throughout their lives and accumulated a range of adverse experiences. So this means that people using the service may be experiencing trauma due to multiple events. So with Redress, I was part of a team in the Scottish Government trying to build trauma-informed principles into every aspect of the service. And as a content designer, my particular bit was the application form and the guidance that went with it. That trauma-informed practice often works by making a connection and by building trust. So for example, a support worker will build a relationship over time using trauma-informed principles to make sure the person they are supporting is comfortable. But how do you do that with content? Content is essentially one-sided. It doesn't often let you have a conversation or build a relationship with a person. Once we publish it, our users are generally on their own. We can't make them a cup of tea if something's upsetting. We can't hold their hand as they go through a difficult process. So when I started working on Redress, I was looking for information about trauma-informed content, and there isn't a lot. People are talking about it in terms of user research and service design, but not in terms of words. So we had to learn by doing, and by using these trauma-informed principles as a framework. And I'm going to talk you through them now. So depending on who you ask, there are 5 or 6 principles to trauma-informed practice. We're going to go with all 6. And they are safety, trust, choice, empowerment, collaboration, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. And this last one is the one that sometimes isn't included, but we're going to touch on it today. And we'll talk through all of these in order and what they mean. So safety is the first one, and incorporating safety into your content is about avoiding causing further harm. So your website, your service, your letter, your app should not re-traumatize the person using it. There are lots of ways you can make someone feel safe or safer online. A couple of practical examples. Sometimes the need for safety is immediate. You may need to include a safe exit option for your website, and this is common for sites that provide support for vulnerable people. So if you're including a safe exit option, there are some excellent resources to help, and gov.uk recently published a blog on their Exit This Page element. You can also try to prevent re-traumatization through content or trigger warnings, and the intention is to warn someone about the content that's coming up so they can choose to proceed or not. By doing this, you're also incorporating choice, which is principle number 3. There is some recent thinking that suggests that content warnings themselves can be traumatic. It's interesting research, watching that space closely, but for now, I would advocate giving people the choice about if and when they want to continue with content. So coming back to Redress, the application forms were long, and we knew it wouldn't be an easy task for someone to go through them, because as well as the pressure and the difficulty involved in the form, there was for many of the applicants a sense of dread about when were the really difficult questions going to come in this 24-page form? When were they going to have to talk about their experiences in care? So what did we do? Well, we told them what was coming next. And this meant they didn't have to hold their breath, and they weren't turning over a page and coming face to face with the question that could re-traumatize them. We took away the jump scare moment of content. This created some safety, but it also gave them choice. Do I want to do this right now? Do I want to stop? Do I need to take care of myself or get some help before I go further? Because safety is also about providing support. And with Redress, we did that in as many ways as we could. So applicants could call or email case advisors to ask questions about the form or the scheme. There was external support available to help them through the application process. But again, we did the best we could with our content. So we added guidance text on the side of the form to explain how to answer questions. And we put a reminder at the end of each section that they were welcome to get in touch if they needed help, like the one on this image says, do you want help with this section? And then list ways to get in touch. And we also made it clear that they could send in a form that wasn't complete and someone would help them. There was a lot of fear that if they didn't complete the form perfectly, they would be rejected. So doing all of this helped set them up for success, and it reduced the risk that someone would be unsuccessful, which could potentially cause them further harm. And finally, we thought about the impact of overwhelming people with information. So I was at a webinar last year where a disabled speaker talked about the impact searching for information had on her and her energy levels. And searching for information might be the only task that she could complete that day because it can be mentally and physically exhausting. So when I started with Redress, there was an idea that we should take all the information people might ever need to know and put it all into one booklet and send it out to the applicants. So we're talking legislation, subordinate legislation, tables of fees, policy memorandums, all of it. And we plotted it out and it was going to be close to 100 pages. So that's a lot. It's a lot to give someone who may have low literacy. It's a lot to give someone who may take months to complete an application form because they can only face doing it a bit at a time. Frankly, it's a lot for anyone, but we are falling into that trap that we should just give people all the information just in case. We may be overwhelming them, but it's better they have it than they don't. But don't do that. Think about what information the person needs at that moment and don't overwhelm them with more than they need to know right now. So moving on to our second principle, which is trust. And as we said, content is often one way. And once we publish, there's no back and forth interaction. So how do you build trust with the person at the other end? Well, content can lose trust by being inaccurate, out-of-date information, broken links, poor presentation. They can all add to a sense of mistrust. But content also needs to be clear. So use language that's easy to understand so people know what they need to do. They don't feel tricked by jargon or technical terms. Make your content easy and logical to find so people don't feel like they have to hunt for the information they need. You don't want to make people feel like you're hiding something or trying to catch them out. Use the language that your users use. Talk to them where they're at in their voice, and don't force them to learn a new language or vocabulary to access your information. And a big one, if you're asking for information in a forum as part of your service, first ask yourself why. Do you need to ask this? Why? Can you say why? The easiest thing to do to reduce the mental load on someone is to take things away. Words, visual noise, any demand on them that we don't need. Do you really need to know their middle name, their date of birth, their title? And if you do need to ask for it, can you explain why you're asking and what you will use that information for? Wherever possible, try to build some trust by explaining why you need that information and what you're going to do with it. Do your questions duplicate or repeat? Are you asking the same information more than once? If so, can you remove or consolidate questions? If there's an easier way to ask a question or get information, use it. And by easier, that means for the person answering the question, not the organization asking it. So questions add cognitive load. Make it as easy as possible for someone to get through your questions quickly and easily. Where you can, help someone answer the question by giving tips or guidance on what sort of answer you're expecting. If someone needs to use a certain date format or answer in a certain way, don't assume they'll get it right unless you tell them. Principle number 3, choice. If possible and practical, give people choice. Let them choose how or when they access your content, or tell them if they have the choice to go somewhere else. Have different ways to support different people. In redress, we had those support options I mentioned. Some applicants might want to speak to a person on the telephone for support. Others might want to be able to access information independently. But if your user has a choice, let them know what it is. Can they change an appointment time? Can they bring someone with them? Can they have a conversation rather than filling in a form? Can they request material in another format or another language? But make the choice meaningful. This is not a meaningful choice. If you're not comfortable with a male examiner, you can request a female. Please keep in mind this may delay your appointment, or this may not always be possible. This is the illusion of choice. These are not choices that provide reassurance. They create uncertainty. They make the person reading them feel like they're the problem. You can't always meet every user's every need, but you can be as flexible as possible and always give clear instructions on things like time limits, timescales, and next steps. So on to empowerment, and can your content empower people? Absolutely. Clear, accessible content can support someone to act independently, to make their own decisions, or to learn something new. But it has to be all those things that good content is: understandable, findable, and clear. The opposite of that is content that makes someone struggle to access it, to understand it, or to complete a task without help. In other words, content that disempowers people. I once tested a piece of content with someone who described themselves as severely dyslexic, and they regularly used a screen reader, and they expected they would need help to go through the content. So we began the testing, and because we'd followed good content design principles, the page we were looking at was designed to be clear and simple. It was also designed to be ready for that screen reader if they needed it. But the person we were testing with read it all independently. And at the end of the testing, they said how proud they were that they'd managed to do it by themselves. And it was one of my best work moments because that person had been empowered by reading a page of content independently and understanding it. And that's really not too much to ask, is it? Creating clear content means that people can read and understand it, and they're not left feeling confused or frustrated, which is definitely an empowering feeling. And empowerment crosses neatly into collaboration. So people who've been traumatized might feel powerless, excluded, and not heard, and collaborating can redress that balance. Earlier this year, I listened to Helen Lawson, who's the lead content designer at Co-op Funeral Care, and she was speaking at a webinar about content for death and dying. And she talked about user research her team had been doing around funeral planning. And this involved talking to people who'd recently planned a funeral for someone. And they were interviewing a man who'd arranged his mother's funeral. And at one point, he was asked what advice he would give someone who had to arrange a funeral. And he choked up and he couldn't speak. And the researcher gave him time and asked if he wanted to continue with the interview. And he did, and he said he wanted to carry on because he wanted to help others who have to arrange a funeral. So being able to turn trauma into something that helps can be empowering, and it's done through collaboration. When you're creating content for people who've experienced trauma, working with them is even more important than usual. Doing research or creating content with people who've experienced trauma needs careful preparation and planning, and you have to consider ethics, safeguarding, and support both before and after the research sessions. You shouldn't expect the impact of your research to just be contained to the session itself. So we worked with some wonderful liaison officers in Redress, and before any user research, they had preliminary phone calls with the participants, and they followed up with them again after. And they made sure that we were aware of the emotional toll that research took on participants, and they did their best to care for them. If direct contact would potentially re-traumatize someone, you can consider involving organizations who have existed trusted relationships with users. But basically, trauma-informed user research is a whole talk in itself. If you're going down this route, find a good user researcher and have a chat with them. There's too much to cover here, but what I want you to know is that it's not impossible to do. It just takes careful thinking and preparation. Now, as a content designer, I'm used to testing everything with my users and as often as possible. But in Redress, that just wasn't appropriate. The impact on the survivors we tested with was significant, as was the impact on the liaison officers who were supporting them. So we used non-survivors and proxy users to test some of the more practical things, like the flow of web pages or the forms for reclaiming expenses. And this meant we concentrated our survivor engagement on the areas that really mattered to our work. And that testing was so powerful for testing our assumptions. And one example I'd like to give you is about how we got it wrong. So I mentioned before that there were two types of application, one for £10,000 and another for up to £100,000. And the higher payment was individually assessed based on the survivor's experiences. So the more detail and evidence they could provide, the better. For the fixed payment of £10,000, they had to show they were in care and they had to give one example of abuse. So based on this, we assumed two types of applicants, one who was willing to talk about their experiences and another who wasn't. And for the second type, we wanted to keep them safe. We wanted them to know they only had to tell us the bare minimum and nothing more. So again, how do we do that with words? Well, we created an almost fill in the blank structure, and it walked them through what they needed to provide. It was a small box on the form to show that they didn't have to write a lot. They essentially completed this sentence. When I was X years old, in X state, in X place, X happened to me. And that was it. One sentence, nice and safe, literally contained in a little box. But we got it wrong. And when we showed it to survivors, they hated it. They absolutely hated it because they said it disempowered them. They wanted the choice and the power to say as much or as little as they wanted, and they wanted us to listen to what they chose to say. They didn't want the trauma that they had carried with them to be reduced to one sentence in a little box. And this was such a valuable lesson. We thought we were providing safety, but we had taken away empowerment, and we wouldn't have known that without collaboration. And just so you know, we fixed it. So we created guidance that said they could write as much or as little as they wanted, as long as they covered the minimum criteria. And the guidance now reads, it's up to you how much information you want to include. And it says, you don't have to write a lot unless you want to. And they like that a lot more. So finally, the last principle, our content should always be inclusive. We take care to write respectfully and inclusively about things like gender, age, and disability. And trauma-informed practice thinks about cultural, historical, and gender issues too. And this means considering things like values, language, belief, and customs. And you may also incorporate traditional cultural connections and recognize the need to address historical trauma. As with everything else I've said today, the main messages here are don't assume and do your research. A few years ago, I was working on a bill about FGM protection orders, and I did a bit of reading and I learned about the groups primarily affected by this in the UK. So trying to take an inclusive approach, I had the great idea that we should translate our consultation on the bill and the privacy notice into the main languages spoken by those groups. It was a good idea, I thought. So I called an organization that worked with FGM survivors just to check that I had the right languages. And they told me, don't bother. They said the literacy rates of the women they worked with were so low that many wouldn't be able to understand a privacy notice regardless of the language it was in. They said the women generally preferred short videos they could watch on their phones. So that was lesson number 1. And after that, I realized how much I didn't know. So I worked closely with the charity I'd called because they'd already built trusted relationships with the women we wanted to hear from. And through them, I began to understand more about the beliefs and the cultures of these women. And one thing that became clear was that in this case, I should be a content producer rather than a content creator. By this, I mean taking more of a commissioning role. Helping these survivors to share their experiences in a safe, supported way would be the most valuable content I could create. So with our outreach team, working in partnership with that charity, we taught them how to do digital storytelling. And digital storytelling mixes voice and images, and we worked with the women to write their own scripts. So creating the scripts in collaboration with the charity meant they had trusted support and safety as they wrote about their trauma. They had the choice of what to include and how to share it. The videos they produced could give their evidence to the committee in a safe and anonymous way, but crucially still in their own words, rather than having someone speak for them. They were able to use their own voices and their own experiences to change things for other women, and that was empowering. So it was, in the end, a perfect lesson, both in what not to do, make a well-meaning decision without research, and what to do. Because the end result was a perfect example of putting trauma-informed principles into action to create content. Just going to pause for a minute. You might be hearing my cuckoo clock going off. It's got a few more chimes. Nearly finished. There we go. So, as I've said throughout this talk, you have to remember you don't know what your users are going through, and not to assume. So I'd like to finish with an experience again from working on redress. Now, remember, the applicants had to fill in a lot of questions, and what we'd done was try and make it less of a huge task for them. So we separated out the questions that would determine if someone was eligible for the scheme, and what we called the more difficult questions, the ones where they'd have to go into detail about what happened to them. So we started off with the easy questions. And what are the easiest questions that you can ask someone in a form? I won't make you come off mute and shout it out, but I'm hoping that you are all shouting at your screen, name, and maybe date of birth. So if I can just ask you now to take a minute and think about how it would feel for you to answer those questions if I asked you right now. How did it feel? Probably easy, straightforward, not too stressful. So that's what we thought we were doing. We asked essential information, easy to answer, to get the applicants off to a good start. But then we tested it, and it turns out that for a lot of people who are applying to the scheme, these were not easy questions. Some of them had had their names changed by adoption or because they were called a different name when they went into the care setting they were in. Some of them didn't know their date of birth because records had been lost, destroyed, or not kept. So these easy questions were actually not easy at all. So what could we do? Well, there was no way of getting around the fact that we needed a name and date of birth. We had to ask those questions. But we could put words around them that recognized there might be some difficulty in answering. So we added a note that explained in some cases your name or date of birth may have changed or be unclear. Please give the name and date of birth you regularly use for official documents. So we couldn't get rid of the trauma, but we could do our best not to add for it. And for many people, our assumption would have been right. Name and date of birth were easy, but not here. So don't assume. Test wherever you can. And what I've just told you shouldn't be seen as the rules, because you can't have a checklist for trauma. Everyone experiences it differently. Every scenario is different. But you can be trauma aware and you can be trauma informed. And wherever you can use your content to empower people. Now, I said earlier that there weren't many resources available about trauma-informed content design, and that is changing, and people are writing and thinking about it more. Here is a great poster from the Home Office about designing for anxiety. It sort of sums up what I've been saying, but it does it with pretty pictures and in less than half an hour. You can find it by searching accessibility posters designing for anxiety. And I wrote a blog about this, which is just an intro over some of what we've talked about today. But if you want a refresher or a reference, it is available, and you can find it on the Content Design London blog. And if you're working in this area or if you're interested in it, I would love to hear from you. So please keep in touch. You can find me on LinkedIn. My email is on the screen, and you can find me on the Content Design London website. So that is it. Over to you for any questions, but I will leave the screen just up for a minute because I've got a little QR code there. And if I've done this right, I would love it if you could just pop on to Slido and give me any feedback about this talk today. So I'll just leave that for a minute so that you can fire up your cameras and start thinking of questions.